end up with this disparity of like, educationally, these children could access that if you put in enough provision. And that's ultimately where creativity in the classroom is really key. So, for example, the children I taught struggled with their times tables. And I found quite a lot of times tables set to Taylor Swift music. So I had a big group in my class, loved Taylor Swift, didn't know their 4 times tables. So quite often you'd come around to my classroom and they would be singing Taylor Swift, but in the 4 times table, because it's making that learning accessible.
Join me, Jeremy Swick, on Into the Unknown, a podcast that delves into the personal journeys, stories, and experiences of individuals across diverse professions. As a historian by trade, I firmly believe that our personal histories shape our present and offer valuable insights into our paths ahead. With that being said, let's get into it. On this episode of Into the Unknown, I'm joined with a very special guest, Kate Edwards. How are you today, Kate?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. How are
I'm
you?
doing amazing. I'm really excited to get into our conversation today.
Yeah, likewise.
So I'd like to kick off the show and talk the importance of networking. How are we actually connected?
Yeah, so connected via an interest to podcast together, I think, was the origins of this relationship. I tend to like to meet everyone that I potentially might podcast with, and just felt we had a really good connection. So that's how this was
It
born.
really is awesome with technology, social media, and all that good stuff because when you have those kind of similar interests and goals in mind, it's a great chance and great opportunity to meet like-minded people.
Yeah, absolutely, and it does make a big difference. And I think it's also really interesting, like the connection of what you connect with others over. And obviously, we had a shared connection around education. So yeah, it's always good to have a conversation with different individuals and different perspectives. And obviously, it was great we had a shared aim and goal
I
going
think it
forward.
really is. And of course, I always tell people not every match is perfect, especially in some of those groups. While they are amazing, sometimes it's not the right vibe. And I'm just fortunate that in our case, we had our little pre call and, it was a really good conversation. It made me excited to talk to you even further.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, like not always that connection. So yeah, excited to kick
So
off
I want to
today.
know a little bit more about you, that origin story. Comic book issue number 1. Who's Kate?
Yeah, so I currently work as a career and accredited ADHD coach based in the UK but cover worldwide. I have had quite a constellation of professional endeavours, shall we say. So I have got a degree in graphic design. I'm a qualified primary school teacher. I've covered every part of the end-to-end journey for customer experience. So right from new business through to post-sales escalations, and currently running a business full time, working full time, and doing a full time, probably part time master's with an AI specialism at the moment as well.
That is definitely a constellation. I really appreciate how you said that. A constellation of different jobs and outlooks.
Yeah, for sure. I think forgot to add in there that I'm also a qualified hairdresser, makeup artist, and nail technician. So yeah, I was the perfect storm to be stuck in house with during COVID. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm curious, what was the first one? What was the first kind of journey for you out of those that wide array of careers?
Yeah, so I was in education, undiagnosed ADHD at this point, unaware that that was potentially on the radar, was deciding between going to college and doing graphic design and then or going and training to be a hairdresser. And I went to the open day for the college, and the guy that showed me around was like, just to let you know, there's no jobs in graphic design. We get tons of graduates that come out and we can't place them. So I was like, great, I'll train and be a hairdresser. So went and trained, did my hairdressing qualifications, came out and launched my own business, but was like, ultimately at the time, was wanting to buy my own place. So I was like, I just need to secure some employment alongside that. So when I worked at an internet dating company, which was as exciting as it sounds, and then ended up working in business risk consulting. So worked in business risk consulting, which was very much about like creating disaster recovery plans, like what happens to, for example, if you've got business and it's right near a bridge or water, like what happens if it floods, like where is your equipment? So did disaster recovery planning for work, did it for my life, and ultimately that ended up sort of paving the direction for where everything went from that point, shall we say.
Take me to that next point because that seemed interesting. As you mentioned, a lot of times with graphic design and things like that, there aren't as many jobs, or at least it's a lot more difficult coming out of college. You start your own business, but you also kind of need that extra income because, as we know with businesses, they don't always feed themselves right away. So take me through what happened after you were in the risk management space.
Yeah, so I was 19 with a mortgage. So had my own place at 19, hence the having a job. I ran my business and did a degree. So that's when I did a degree. I'd done qualifications in graphic design alongside my hairdressing, and then was like, ultimately, probably at the point I now need to do a degree. So went off and did a degree at home while I was also looking after young children, running my own business, doing a degree as you do. And then sort of hit sort of a crossroads, like COVID hit, and I was like, oh, hadn't really planned for worldwide pandemic on my disaster recovery plan. And generally most people didn't. And fortunately for me, the company I worked at, I ended up doing the lawyer's hair that worked there. And I was like, look, quick question. I was like, had you got worldwide pandemic like on your radar? Like, is this something that I really missed the ball and dropped the ball on? And she's like, no, don't worry, no, none of us did. So my focus at that point was like, I don't have any income, I'm self-employed, I'm going to train and be a primary school teacher. So during COVID, I trained and became a qualified primary school teacher. And ultimately had some health challenges and was really unwell, and came out of COVID going, actually, I don't want to be a teacher long term. It's probably not where my skill sets are most aligned. But ultimately, I knew I didn't want to run my business anymore, partly health related. Also, customer buying behavior had really changed and it had taken over my life. So I ended up sort of going, okay, I want to do something different. And that's when I went back into the corporate world. And then a couple of years later, did my qualifications from coaching after like a natural progression into like coaching and mentoring. And then got diagnosed with having ADHD, which made complete sense of why my career had not been a linear trajectory of regular progressive roles. And that's sort of where I got to this point, really.
What drew you to education to begin with?
Yeah, so I have always wanted to help people. I've always gone on the mindset, I think we've spoken about it, or like wanting to give back. And I'm very much in the mindset like I've always wanted to be somebody that leaves the world a greater place than I went into it. And that sounds really cliche. And I know that's like probably what everyone says, like, oh, I want to make a difference. But I always like got the mindset, if I can make one person's life better, I've achieved what I wanted to do. And a lot of my friends were in the education sector, and I'd spent a year volunteering in a classroom. And it's a very diverse and interesting environment. And kids are brutal, like really brutal. And I think you leverage so many skills that you wouldn't leverage if you weren't in that environment.
Kate, I couldn't agree more. And it's one of those things that I really appreciate my time in the classroom. I appreciate my education training because it worked on so many of those soft people skills that I don't think I would have harnessed as well as I did after being in the classroom. I tell people live TV, doing podcasts is the easiest thing on the planet. What's scary? Being in front of a group of middle school students as they're sitting there judging you, laughing, crying, all in the same class period. And it's one of those things that brought so much, I think, confidence in me, but also kind of that working on those other intangible skills, if you will.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I spent 7 weeks back in the classroom just before Christmas, um, and kids are interesting. I'd say, I personally think everybody should have to spend a period of time with children in a classroom. And for me, now being diagnosed with ADHD, going back into an education setting and understanding so much more about human behavior and things that interest children with ADHD versus things that don't interest children with ADHD, it made me a much more creative teacher. I 100% would advocate for everyone to have to go and at least teach one lesson to 30 children.
I couldn't agree more. Out of curiosity, you had mentioned you were diagnosed with ADHD. What made you actually go get tested? Because as you mentioned, it kind of unlocked a lot for you, I should say, and understanding a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so the big, like, it sounds really sort of stereotypical, sort of a bit random. So I'd started, obviously, I'd hit an algorithm somewhere of getting memes and clips pop up, and I was like, oh, that's me. And then I was like, oh, that's me. And I was like, oh my God, that's me. Like, I'd obviously hit the ADHD algorithm with what I'd been searching, content that I'd liked. Um, and I was like, oh, I think this is me. And then I had a connection through LinkedIn. And she'd posted about being diagnosed, and I just reached out to her and I was like, hey, I think this is me. And I didn't talk to anyone about the whole concept for quite a while, because my perception of ADHD was very different to how maybe like adult females get generally diagnosed. So I reached out to her and was like, hey, I think I might have ADHD. And I approached my GP, like my doctor, and I said, look, I think this is me. And he was like, you have to fill out a questionnaire. Um, and just to let you know, the wait's really long in the UK for diagnosis. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't really want to be in limbo. And I'm now hyperfixated on the fact that I think I've got ADHD, which, to be fair, should have been the test in itself. And I reached out back out to her and I was like, did you go privately? And she said, yeah. And I reached out to a company that were vetted. I went through their process. The psychologist was like, I could tell you'd got ADHD before we'd even got about 15 minutes into the call, because she said, I asked you one thing and you'd gone off on a complete tangent down a rabbit hole about something else. So she said, I probably didn't need to ask you the rest of the questions. But ultimately, I was like, this explains so much of what I've done. And I couldn't understand why, logically, I couldn't go and sit in an office 5 days a week. I was like, why am I finding this so difficult? Yet everyone else seems to find this fine. Like, and that's why a classroom for somebody with ADHD is actually quite a good environment, because it's constantly changing. You're always moving. It's very reactive. And I used to sit in an office and I would sit there and be like, okay, I went to the toilet 25 minutes ago. I cannot get off this seat for at least another 20 minutes, or I'm going to look like I've got bladder issues. And I was like, I can be in the toilet logically for about 5 minutes before, again, it starts to look a bit questionable. But I was timing when I was going to the bathroom, because I was like, I can't sit in this seat. Um, so for me, it just answered a lot of questions. Like, it made sense why I found things difficult. I started to understand why I was questioning things. But ultimately, that's how it came
That's really
about.
interesting. And I think it is one of those things, as you mentioned, being in that, I should say, in that office space. And I completely understand the feeling. While I don't have ADHD, I crawl in my skin when I was in the office, like the more traditional cubicle, and it's like I like what I'm doing, but like again, as you mentioned, your time and your space, I'm just like I'm digging my trying to figure out my way out of there, and it's one of those things I do love about the classroom too, because as you mentioned, there is so much movement and things going on, and I remember even as students, you're moving from one class to the next as teachers, you know. In theory, you're able to kind of create your own lessons and kind of I really love the idea of activating kind of all the senses that you can in each lesson, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this is the thing, and certainly within the UK education system, we have like a gifted and talented program, and children that excel in the classroom can go off and they do more sort of exploratory work. So they might go off, they'll problem solve, they'll look at a problem. It tends to be like outdoor or hands on, and then ultimately, what happens is those children come back and they go through a process and work out like what happened, what worked, and they can then reiterate that process. Now, that type of work is amazing for people with ADHD. But generally speaking, people with ADHD in the classroom can't sit and digest that information in the same way as neurotypical children. So they don't access the gifted and talented program because they can't access the traditional education learning. So you end up with this disparity of like, educationally, these children could access that if you put in enough provision. And that's ultimately where creativity in the classroom is really key. So, for example, the children I taught struggled with their times tables. And I found quite a lot of times tables set to Taylor Swift music. So I had a big group in my class, loved Taylor Swift, didn't know their 4 times tables. So quite often you'd come around to my classroom and they would be singing Taylor Swift, but in the 4 times table, because it's making that learning accessible. And we aren't programmed as human beings to sit at desks for long periods of time. We're not designed to sit on a carpet for long periods of time, but we expect children in education to do this. And it's the one of the things I wish I could change around education is how we learn, because even as adults we don't necessarily learn in that way, but it's how we're taught and how we're expected to
Kid, I
learn.
really appreciate that. As you mentioned, as adults, it's kind of, as you mentioned, the expectation that a lot of times traditionally going to the office, you work 9 to 5, you get your lunch break at some point, but you're kind of at your desk. And as you mentioned, you're timing your time to leave and come back. And I think it's one of those things that as adults, and I think a lot of what you get into is kind of have that opportunity to move around and I guess create something different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like with corporate living and corporate expectations of like sitting in a meeting for 2 hours, most people lose focus after 45 minutes. 2 hours is too long. We're not designed to sit and focus on something for 2 hours. And if you look at the primitive development of humans, for example, we're not designed to focus on one thing. So if you look back when we were picking berries in the like long time ago, pre obviously social media, etc., you weren't 100% focused on that task. So if you picked berries and had no alternative focus or no ability to be aware of your surroundings, and a bear came, the bear would just eat you while you were picking the berries. Work wise, school wise, you're expected to focus on one thing and not have a secondary distraction. However, primitively, we would have had that secondary distraction because it stopped us getting eaten by a bear. And it comes back to going, that's who we are as humans, and that's what we should have as humans, but we seem to have lost along the way.
Kate, I couldn't agree more. Out of curiosity, with what you do as a business, how does that? What do you do to work on that? I guess for others as well.
Yeah, so I obviously offer coaching. So I work worldwide with clients in terms of I cover US and the UK and anywhere in between, essentially. And I quite often will say to clients, like, if you want to do this on your walk in, and you want to do it as long as you've got Wi-Fi or access to data, and you want to do a coaching call when you're out, do a coaching call when you're out. Like I quite often will say to clients, don't focus on taking notes. Just focus on the here and now, and I'll provide you with a summary after, essentially what we've talked about, like next steps and things. So it's being understanding around that. And I know for focus that really any longer than 55 minutes, 55 minutes, the attention span's gone. So again, I don't offer longer coaching sessions because I know that actually it makes it much more challenging and the focus tends to not be there. I also say to clients, like, I've got ADHD myself. I generally will sit and fidget with something. You'll probably notice on this podcast, I sit and move around. Like, I'm quite an animated person. That sort of thing's totally fine because I know that other people can sometimes feel uncomfortable with that sort of thing. Again, if you're someone that doesn't like having a camera on, I'm like, no pressure to have a camera on. I really don't mind. I can sit camera off too. So I think it's just being understanding about like individual needs, individual people's preference. Again, like as you get older, people are like, oh, how do you learn? Are you a visual learner? Are you a kinesthetic learner? Are you an auditory learner? Like we don't ask kids that, but we expect them to all impart take that knowledge in. And I think it comes down to like again just understanding what works for people and what doesn't. So I've quite often voice clipped people with information if that's their preference of how they
Kate,
work.
I really appreciate that idea of just being understanding. And one of the beauties, at least for me in my business, is since it's my own business, that means there's times I edit. There's times, as we talked a little bit earlier before we recorded, sometimes I'm recording a ton of podcasts in a row just because then I have my summer to do a little bit more of what I want to do or not feel the pressure, making sure the podcasting aspect is still enjoyable for me because, I'm sure. I think we've all had that in our business or our life if we start dreading doing something and it feels like that Sunday before you go to work, that it becomes a lot less enjoyable to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you have to understand, like, life has ebbs and flows, and people are like, "Oh, I didn't give 100% today," and I'm like, "Okay, but what was your energy at?" And they're like, 40, and I'm like, "Okay, so what percent did you give for work?" And they're like, "Well, like 38, 39, maybe 40," and I'm like, "So you gave 100%, but it just wasn't 100% as a number. It was 100% of what you had available, but it wasn't 100%." Like, that's the same thing. 40 at 40 is 100%. And it is shifting that mindset to start to understand, like, we don't all work at the same productivity level Monday to Friday, 9 to 5:30. Like, that's just not realistically how it works. And for me, for example, I know that generally, if I want to do something focused, it needs to really be later in the evening. And that's fine. That's when I do my focus task. And that's what works for me. But it's having that understanding and self awareness of how we best function. And again, that comes back the same as education. Like, with children, you can't expect them all to sit, 30 of them, in a militant style for 7 hours a day and think that they're all going to perform, because we are all individual humans and that's not how we
Kate,
work.
I really appreciate that. I know you touched on it before, but we ask as adults, how do you learn best? And I don't think in the classroom I was ever asked that as a student of how do I learn best? And it's like, of course, sitting there quietly was just not my style. And of course, maybe some it is, but I think there's so much in education that obviously, I think we can both agree leaves a bit to be desired. But I think it's kind of having that creativity as educators or people who care about the school system to kind of try to create those kind of avenues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is creative thought. And I think that can be applied in any setting, education, business. It's going, okay, so what works for you? And I tend to find that when I'm, for example, presenting something back to somebody, so I've had people say, "Oh, can you just share back?" I'm like, "Yeah, great. I'll share a slide deck. I'm going to share you a Loom video. The Loom video is 4.5 minutes." Now, I know myself, if somebody shares something and it's a long word email, the likeliness is I'm not going to read it. And the irony is, I actually got made redundant on an email, and it was a lengthy email. And I read the first 5 lines, and I was like, "Yeah, I don't need to read the rest of this." And then somebody was like, "Oh, they're making people redundant." I'm like, "Are they?" They're like, "Yeah, did you not get the email?" I was like, "Didn't read it. Too long." So it is just understanding and being sympathetic. And like, with the education sector, that's the case of, like, if you're giving instructions to kids, put something on the board, for example, visual, and then say, "Who wants to come and watch me do that?" So it is about being clever. It's using alternative ways of working. And again, this transcends to the corporate world. Like, if you're running workshops for people, don't sit and expect them to look at a board for 7 hours of the day. Like, get them up, get them doing stuff, have tangible things for them to touch and do, and get them moving around a room. And it's just being clever and creative with what you're delivering, and working on the output rather than the mechanism to get
Kate, I
there.
couldn't agree more. And I think also when you do those comfort style workshops, I think it becomes more memorable and it actually sinks in if you are up and doing it. Because as you mentioned, if we're sitting there for 6, 7 hours, and I've been to workshops like that, like my brain is off after like 8 minutes. And I'm just like, okay, well, I guess I'm trying to take notes, but my handwriting's terrible. So can I get this like the audio version of this? Because I'm not going to retain anything. I'm going to look 20 minutes later at my notes and I can barely read them anyway. So it's like, sometimes I think a lot, I think we're kind of on the same page in the sense that finding those creative ways to get people engaged is so important.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I there was a documentary in the UK. It was quite a long time ago. There's an actress over here, Cara Toynton, and she was in a soap. And she is dyslexic, and she said for her, learning her lines is so challenging because it's like she's learning it in a second language, and that's what they likened it to. And she was saying for her, she would put her lines and link them to certain parts of the room. So she'd go to the fridge for understanding certain lines, and she'd walk around and she'd create the mental map of the room to understand the learnings. And I think it's being creative with how you get to the solution. And the journey shouldn't matter as long as you get the result that you want. And as you said, like, it's just thinking out the box and just being mindful of that.
Kate, I couldn't agree more. On everyone's journey, you make a decision not really knowing the outcome. Can you give me a time where you just went for it and how it turned out?
Yeah, so I've done that a number of times. Again, I think it's that sort of, ADHD side that's just like, we'll give it a go. So I worked at a training and negotiation company. I had been running my business alongside having a part-time job for obviously having a mortgage, and I just found out I was expecting my second child. And I thought, do you know what? This is the perfect time. Not really sure it was the perfect time for me to hand in my notice at my paid job and go for it with a self-employed business. And I thought, do you know what? If it doesn't work, I can try it for 6 months, and I can then fold it when I go on maternity leave. Because we get a paid period of time in the UK off, and I can go back and then look for a new corporate job. So I handed my notice in and went for it, knowing that I would be essentially building a business for 6 months that I then would be collapsing for 6 to 9 months. And I just went for it, and I ended up running that business for 8 years in the end. Very successful, established by a client base of 125 customers. And this was pre my coaching business. So it gave me an opportunity to learn about running a business, learn about the pitfalls, the things you don't do. But ultimately, it was one where I gave up stable income because I was like, I'm going to pursue this opportunity, and this is what I want to do.
Kate, that's incredible. And I think it's one of those things, I don't know how else to describe it, when you go all in on yourself and you just kind of start to see the fruits of your labor. It really just is an amazing feeling. And I don't even know if I can describe it to others who haven't been there yet, but it's just something about betting on yourself is incredible.
I just always say, if you can't be a cheerleader for yourself, how can you expect others to be? And that comes down to belief in yourself, advocating for who you are, and really pushing for that. And that takes work. That's not an easy journey. But when you start to know your own worth and know what you bring, you suddenly end up in a hell of a lot more powerful position than you were before.
Kate, I could not agree more. It's one of those things you look back even a few months, as you mentioned, 6, 8 months, a year, and you're like, I can't believe how much my business has grown, but also how I've grown as a person. It's so rewarding.
Yeah, for sure. It does make a huge
Title of
difference.
the podcast, Into the Unknown. What are you working on now, and where can people learn more about what you do?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm working on a number of things, including updating my website, which is 8percentcoaching.com. I am currently doing a master's because life's too short, and I live on the motto of, if you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much room, a little bit too literally. So yeah, I'm available on my website. Feel free to drop me an email at hello@8percentcoaching.com, or I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook under the same
Well,
handle.
Kate, I want to say thank you again for taking the time to talk with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, likewise, it's great to connect, and obviously that mutual educational theme is always really interesting to talk about as well.
Another fun episode of Into the Unknown. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. And if it provides you any value or entertainment, I would love if you shared it with others, liked, subscribed, and really just help the podcast grow. Again, tell a friend, tell a foe, just anyone who might enjoy hearing some stories of people's own journeys and what got them to where they are today. Till next time.